For 9 years, my husband looked at me with a mixture of pity and resentment, blaming me for the echoing silence in our home. Then he walked through the front door with my younger sister, whose stomach was visibly swollen with his children. He looked me dead in the eye and told me he had simply married the wrong sister. He demanded I sign the divorce papers, expecting me to drop to my knees and beg. Instead, I signed them without shedding a single tear. He thought he had won the ultimate prize. He had no idea that my signature just triggered a financial guillotine that would sever his entire livelihood. And he certainly did not know that his own mother was about to drop a medical truth bomb that would shatter his fragile reality into a million unrecoverable pieces. It was a Thursday evening in late September. The Georgia heat still clung to the windows of the custom-built Atlanta estate I had purchased for us. I was standing in the grand foyer admiring the way the evening light caught the imported marble floors. I had just returned from a tasting for my culinary group, finalizing a menu for a high-profile charity gala. I was wearing my favorite tailored emerald suit, feeling accomplished and ready to spend a quiet evening with the man I had built my life around. Then the heavy mahogany front door swung open. Julian stepped inside first. He was wearing his usual tailored navy suit, looking every bit the successful commercial real estate broker he pretended to be. But he was not alone. His arm was wrapped tightly and protectively around my younger sister, Jasmine. She wore a clinging designer maternity dress that left absolutely no room for interpretation. Her stomach was rounded, unmistakable, and proudly displayed. I stood frozen, perfectly still, as the reality of the image in front of me began to process. Julian did not look ashamed. He did not look like a man caught in a terrible betrayal. He looked defiant. He looked proud. He gently guided Jasmine into the foyer as if she were made of fragile glass. I looked from his hand on her waist, up to his face, waiting for an explanation that could somehow make sense of this nightmare. Julian did not mince his words. He looked around the pristine, quiet foyer and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He told me he was suffocating in this barren house. He said a man of his stature and ambition needed a legacy, and he could no longer pretend he was okay with a quiet, empty home. For 9 years he claimed he had suffered in silence, playing the supportive husband, while I failed to give him the one thing a man truly needed. He spoke with such conviction, portraying himself as a martyr who had endured my alleged inadequacy for nearly a decade. Then he pulled Jasmine slightly closer to his side. He announced with a sickeningly proud smile that Jasmine was pregnant. He made sure to emphasize that she was carrying his twin boys. My own sister stood there, running a manicured hand over her belly, refusing to meet my eyes directly, but carrying a small, unmistakable smirk on her lips. Julian took a thick manila envelope from his briefcase and tossed it onto the entryway table. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with a cold dismissal that I will never forget. He said the words that would ultimately seal his absolute destruction. "Turns out I just married the wrong sister. Sign the papers, Camille." The silence that followed his declaration was deafening. They stood there waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for me to scream, to throw things, to collapse onto the marble floor and ask why. They wanted the satisfaction of my devastation. Jasmine stepped forward, then playing her favorite role of the sweet innocent victim who was just swept up in the tides of destiny. She offered a breathy, syrupy apology. She told me she never meant for this to happen, but that nobody could fight true love. She said Julian finally made her feel safe and cherished. Then she delivered the deepest cut of all with a casual shrug. She revealed that our parents, Vivica and Terrence, already knew. She said they had given the new couple their blessing because family is about supporting new life, and they just wanted Julian to finally be happy. My parents had always enabled Jasmine. She was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one whose charm always excused her reckless behavior. I was just the reliable workhorse who paid for the family dinners and quietly handled my responsibilities. Hearing that my own mother and father had blessed my husband getting my sister pregnant in my own house was a betrayal so profound it actually bypassed sorrow and turned straight into ice. I did not give them the tears they were so desperately thirsty to see. I maintained absolute composure. I turned away from them and walked slowly into the massive chef's kitchen. The heels of my shoes clicked rhythmically against the hardwood, offering the only sound in the house. Julian and Jasmine followed me, trailing behind like spectators at a museum. I stopped at the grand marble island where the manila envelope now lay. I picked up my favorite Mont Blanc pen from the console tray. I slipped the documents from the envelope. I did not read the demands or the stipulations. I did not need to. With a steady hand, I signed my name on every line that required it. The ink flowed smoothly across the pages, finalizing the end of my marriage in less than 2 minutes. I placed the pen down, aligning it perfectly parallel to the stack of papers. Julian looked momentarily confused by my lack of resistance. His brow furrowed slightly as he picked up the documents, checking to make sure I had actually signed them. He smiled a triumphant, arrogant smile, believing he had just secured a clean break and a fresh start with his new perfect family. I walked past his smug expression without a single word. I went upstairs to the master suite and packed a single overnight bag with my most essential items. I walked back down the stairs and headed straight for the front door. Jasmine called out a fake goodbye, telling me she hoped I could find peace. I did not look back. I did not tell Julian that by rushing me to sign those specific papers, he had just legally severed our financial ties, effective immediately. I did not tell him that my signature just triggered a financial guillotine hanging directly over his head, and most importantly, I kept the medical secret regarding his fertility buried deep in the past, where I had hidden it for 9 long years to protect his fragile ego. I drove my car away from the estate and navigated through the evening traffic toward downtown Atlanta. The grief was there, a heavy, suffocating weight in my chest, but I forced it into a small box in the back of my mind. Right now, grief was a luxury I could not afford. Tactical execution was my only priority. I pulled up to a luxury high-rise hotel and checked into their premium penthouse suite. The moment the bellhop left my room and the door clicked shut, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering city skyline. I pulled my phone from my pocket and initiated a secure call to my chief financial officer at the culinary group. He answered on the second ring. I kept my voice brisk and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. I ordered him to immediately dissolve the shell corporation we had set up 5 years ago. I authorized the immediate withdrawal of all anonymous financial backing from Julian's commercial real estate firm. My CFO hesitated for only a fraction of a second before confirming the execution of my orders. Through this single business-driven action, the reality of my marriage was laid bare. Julian believed he was a self-made titan of commercial real estate. He loved to boast at family gatherings about his massive deals and his brilliant market intuition. The truth was, his firm had been hemorrhaging money for years. He was too arrogant to admit his failures and too stubborn to accept help. To protect his pride, I had quietly set up an anonymous angel investment firm funded entirely by the profits of my high-end culinary group. I had been secretly bankrolling his entire existence, his payroll, his office leases, his luxury car payments, all of it. I spent nearly a decade swallowing the shame of our alleged infertility at every Sunday dinner. I endured the judgmental whispers of Julian's extended family. I sat quietly while my mother Vivica made passive-aggressive comments about how a woman's true purpose was motherhood, making sure to praise Jasmine for her vibrant youthful energy while looking at me with subtle disdain. I took all of that pain and humiliation silently to protect a man who was secretly living off my hard-earned wealth. And he repaid me by bringing his pregnant mistress into my home and demanding I leave. As I stood by the penthouse window, nursing a glass of sparkling water, I imagined Julian waking up the next morning in the house I paid for with the sister who had betrayed me. I imagined him making coffee, feeling like the king of the world. Then I imagined his phone ringing. Miles away in that same custom-built kitchen, Julian's phone would begin to ring. It would be his lead investor, the anonymous savior, who had promised to fund his upcoming multi-million-dollar commercial plaza development, calling to announce that all funds were immediately frozen and withdrawn. He would be left scrambling on the very first morning of his grand new life, completely unaware that the architect of his total ruin was the quiet, barren wife he had just thrown away. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, watching the morning sun break over the Atlanta skyline. My phone vibrated violently against the smooth surface of the marble countertop. For a brief second, I expected the caller ID to display Julian's name. I assumed he was calling to scream about his frozen corporate accounts and the sudden disappearance of his lead investor. Instead, the screen illuminated with a name I had not spoken to in nearly half a year. It was Liam. Liam was Jasmine's ex-husband. He was a quiet, mild-mannered white architect from Chicago who had always looked incredibly out of place at our loud, boisterous family Sunday dinners. My parents, Vivica and Terrence, never fully warmed up to him. They treated him with a superficial politeness, while secretly complaining that Jasmine could have found someone with more flash and social capital. Liam had always been decent to me, though. I was one of the few people who noticed when I paid for the expensive family vacations or handled the catering for our parents' anniversary parties. He saw the unequal dynamics but knew better than to speak up in a house ruled by my mother. I picked up the phone. Liam did not bother with pleasantries. His voice sounded raw and exhausted over the line. He asked me if I was sitting down. I told him I was perfectly fine and asked why he was calling so early. He took a deep breath and admitted he had just seen my parents posting on social media. They were already uploading pictures of Jasmine showing off her baby bump, praising her new chapter with Julian, and talking about family blessings. Liam said he felt sick to his stomach seeing my husband in those photos, and he could not let me walk into this blind. He asked me what Jasmine had told everyone about their split. I repeated the narrative my sister had peddled to the entire family. She claimed they had simply grown apart a year ago. She told us she realized she wanted to be closer to her roots and needed to find a man who matched her cultural background and ambitions. Liam let out a bitter, humorless laugh. He told me every single word of that was a meticulously crafted lie. The truth was much darker and far more pathetic. Liam revealed that their divorce was not a mutual decision from a year ago. It was finalized just 4 months ago. He told me he had hired a private investigator after noticing massive, unexplained withdrawals from their joint accounts and strange charges on his credit cards. The investigator uncovered a string of infidelities. Jasmine had not just stepped out on him once. She had been carrying on multiple affairs with personal trainers, club promoters, and amateur musicians for the better part of 2 years. She was using Liam's money to fund luxury hotel stays and expensive gifts for men who offered her fleeting thrills. I listened in silence as Liam detailed the complete destruction of his marriage. He exposed the sheer magnitude of Jasmine's financial desperation. When he confronted her with the evidence, she did not apologize. She threw a tantrum demanding half of everything he owned. But Liam was meticulous. Before they married, he had insisted on a rock-solid prenuptial agreement to protect the architectural firm he built with his partners. Because of the infidelity clause, he was able to initiate a brutal, swift divorce that left her with absolutely nothing. He cut off her credit cards, revoked her access to his luxury vehicles, and kicked her out of his high-rise condo with only the clothes she could carry. Liam explained that Jasmine was drowning in debt. She had secretly racked up over $100,000 in high-interest credit card debt, trying to maintain her image of wealth and success while parading around town. She was completely cut off financially and grew desperate for a new host to maintain her lavish lifestyle. She could not afford to stay in Chicago without him footing the bill, so she packed up and retreated to Atlanta under the guise of missing her family. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with staggering clarity. Jasmine was not a romantic victim swept away by an undeniable passion for my husband. She was a predator who was backed into a corner. She needed a wealthy Mark to take care of her before her debts caught up with her and before the facade of her perfect life shattered. She set her sights on Julian because she believed the illusion he projected. Julian drove a leased sports car, wore custom-tailored suits, and bragged incessantly about closing multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deals. Jasmine thought she was stealing a wildly successful millionaire husband who could wipe away her debts and keep her wrapped in designer brands. I gripped the edge of the countertop as a sharp, dark laugh escaped my throat. The sheer irony of the situation was almost poetic. Jasmine had burned her life to the ground and targeted my husband to save herself. But she had no idea that Julian was completely broke. She had no idea that his entire empire was propped up by my culinary group, and that by stealing him, she had just stolen a man who was now drowning in debt just like she was. They were two parasites who had latched onto each other completely unaware that the host they relied on had just cut the lifeline. Liam asked me why I was laughing. I told him everything. I explained how I had been quietly bankrolling Julian's failing business for years to protect his fragile masculinity. I told him that I had just frozen all the accounts and severed the financial backing. I explained that Julian was waking up this morning with nothing but the clothes on his back and the pregnant mistress he chose over me. The line went quiet for a moment before Liam let out a slow whistle of disbelief. He told me it was exactly what they both deserved. But his tone quickly shifted back to a serious warning. He told me I needed to be incredibly careful. Jasmine was dangerous when she was cornered. He warned me that she would not stop at just taking my husband. She would try to poison the rest of my family against me to ensure she remained the victim and the golden child in their eyes. She would use the pregnancy as a shield and a weapon, manipulating my parents into protecting her at all costs. Liam told me he was gathering all the documentation from their divorce. He offered to send me the private investigators' reports, the financial statements proving her massive debts, and the digital proof of her infidelities. He wanted me to have the ammunition I needed when she inevitably tried to paint herself as a saint. This communication established Liam not just as a sympathetic ear but as a critical ally. We were both casualties of the same toxic family dynamic, and we both understood the depths of Jasmine's depravity. I thanked Liam for his honesty. I told him to send me everything he had. As we ended the call, I looked back out over the city. The morning sun was fully visible now, casting a brilliant light over the buildings. My younger sister had carefully crafted an image of innocence, playing the sweet, helpless girl who just wanted to be loved. My parents had bought into that image entirely, enabling her worst behaviors and punishing me for being the responsible one. But Liam's phone call had given me the final key to understanding the game being played. Jasmine was a predator hiding in plain sight, and Julian was the arrogant fool who fell right into her trap. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they could humiliate me in my own home and walk away with the prize. They had no idea that the prize was worthless, and that the game had only just begun. I poured the rest of my sparkling water down the sink and walked over to my laptop. It was time to prepare for the inevitable fallout with my parents. I knew Vivica and Terrence would be calling soon, demanding that I play the dutiful older sister and step aside gracefully. I needed to be ready to cut them off just as cleanly and ruthlessly as I had cut off my husband. I sat down at the heavy oak desk in the corner of the penthouse suite and opened my laptop. Almost immediately, my phone began to vibrate violently across the polished wood surface. I did not need to look at the screen to know who was trying to reach me. The digital clock in the corner of my monitor read exactly 8 in the morning. Julian had surely made his frantic phone calls by now, and the news of my sudden departure had reached my parents. I picked up the device and unlocked the screen. There were 12 unread messages from my mother, Vivica, and 5 from my father, Terrence. I opened Vivica's messages first, bracing myself for the predictable wave of manipulation. She did not start by asking if I was okay. She did not ask how I was holding up after having my marriage shattered and my home invaded. Her very first message was a command disguised as a prayer. She wrote that God works in mysterious ways, and that a new life is always a blessing from above. She told me that while the situation was unfortunate, I needed to handle this transition with grace. Grace. That was her favorite word whenever she needed me to swallow my pride and clean up a mess. She went on to say that the family reputation was at stake. She reminded me of her standing at the church and how people loved to gossip. She demanded that I not make a public scene, keep the divorce quiet, and allow Julian and Jasmine to settle into their new reality without any bitter resentment from my end. I read the words twice, letting the sheer audacity of her demands sink into my bones. My husband was currently moving his pregnant mistress into the house I paid for, and my mother was worried about the church gossips. She wanted me to quietly step aside and let my younger sister steal my life, because causing a fuss would be tacky. I opened the messages from Terrence expecting at least a shred of fatherly protection. I was wrong. My father was a man who loved the appearance of authority, but possessed none of the actual backbone required to lead. He told me not to do anything rash. He said Julian was a good man who simply made a mistake of passion, and that Jasmine was young and impressionable. He actually had the nerve to write that I had always been the strong one, the independent one who could weather any storm. He told me I would bounce back because I always did, but Jasmine needed support right now because of her delicate condition. I set the phone down and let out a harsh, breathless laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who had just realized she had spent 35 years trying to earn the love of people who only viewed her as a utility. Their messages perfectly encapsulated the twisted dynamic that had governed our family for my entire life. Jasmine was the golden child. She was the beauty queen, the cheerleader, the vibrant social butterfly who could light up a room with her smile. She was allowed to be fragile. She was allowed to make catastrophic mistakes. She was allowed to be selfish because her charm supposedly compensated for her lack of character. I, on the other hand, was the workhorse. From the time I was a teenager, I was told I was the responsible one. When Jasmine wrecked her first car driving home drunk from a party, Vivica and Terrence did not punish her. They simply asked me to use my savings from my high school job to help cover the deductible. When Jasmine dropped out of college after 2 semesters to follow a club promoter to Miami, they threw her a welcome home party when she inevitably returned broke and crying. I paid for the catered food at that party. They weaponized the concept of the strong black woman against their own daughter. Because I was capable, because I built a highly successful culinary group from the ground up, because I never complained and always paid the bills, they decided my feelings simply did not matter. My stability was taken for granted. My quiet dignity was interpreted as an endless capacity to absorb pain. They praised Jasmine for simply existing while viewing my financial support as an obligatory tax I owed them for being born into the family. For years, I had funded their comfortable retirement. I paid for the luxury vacations they bragged about to their friends. I covered the property taxes on their sprawling suburban home. I bought Vivica the designer hats she wore to Sunday service, and I leased the luxury SUV Terrence drove to the golf course. I did it because I believed that providing for my family was the ultimate expression of love. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I was generous enough, they would eventually look at me with the same unconditional adoration they reserved for Jasmine. Reading their text messages, I finally understood the brutal truth. They did not love me. They loved my money. They loved the convenience of my silence. And now that Jasmine had successfully secured a man they believed to be a wealthy real estate tycoon, they felt they no longer needed my quiet, reliable funding. They thought Julian was their new golden ticket, and they were ready to discard me to protect their shiny new investment. They had no idea that Julian was completely bankrupt. They had no idea that by enabling Jasmine to steal my husband, they had just tethered their precious golden child to a sinking ship. I did not reply to their messages. Engaging with narcissists only feeds their desperate need for control and drama. Instead, I turned my attention to the open web browser on my laptop. I logged into my primary wealth management portal. The grief and betrayal that had threatened to suffocate me just an hour ago had been entirely replaced by a cold, calculated focus. I opened the joint family accounts I had established for my parents 5 years ago. There was a checking account designated for their household emergencies, and a savings account I funded monthly for their leisure expenses. With 3 swift clicks, I drained both accounts, transferring the entire balances back into my private corporate holding. Next, I navigated to the credit card portal. I located the 2 platinum supplementary cards I had issued in their names. I watched the transaction history load, noting a charge from a high-end baby boutique made just yesterday by Vivica. She had been buying designer baby clothes for Jasmine's twins using my credit card while keeping the affair a secret from me. The sheer disrespect was almost impressive. I selected both card numbers and hit the button to permanently deactivate them. I was not finished. I logged into the auto-pay systems for my personal accounts. I canceled the recurring payments for Terrence's luxury SUV lease. I canceled the automatic drafts that covered their property taxes and their premium health insurance plans. I even went to the website of their exclusive country club and formally revoked my sponsorship, terminating their membership effective immediately. I systematically severed every single financial cord that attached them to my empire. I cut off their access to my resources with the surgical precision of a doctor amputating a diseased limb. For my entire adult life, I had been their safety net, their silent benefactor, their reliable ATM. As of this exact moment, the bank was permanently closed. My phone screen lit up again. It was a phone call from Vivica. She must have been at a store or trying to book a service, because I knew exactly what prompted the sudden call. Her platinum card had just declined. She was standing at a register somewhere, realizing that the endless well of my generosity had suddenly run completely dry. I watched her name flash on the screen. I imagined her confused, indignant face. I imagined Terrence scrambling to figure out why his lease portal was sending him urgent payment required alerts. They had demanded I handle this transition with grace. There is nothing more graceful than quietly walking away and taking everything that belongs to you. I reached out and pressed the red button to decline the call. I then opened her contact profile, selected the options menu, and pressed block. I did the same for Terrence. I blocked their phone numbers, their email addresses, and their social media accounts. I erected an impenetrable digital wall between my peace and their toxicity. The silence that filled the penthouse after I blocked their numbers was profound. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of a lonely home. It was the crisp, clean silence of absolute liberation. I closed my laptop and let out a long, slow breath. I was entirely alone, but I had never felt more powerful. I had excised the parasites from my life. Now it was time to reflect on the one secret I still held, the ultimate weapon that was about to destroy Julian's fragile reality. The silence in the penthouse gave me the space to finally open a door in my mind that I had kept locked shut for 7 long years. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, closing my eyes and letting the memory wash over me. The crisp air conditioning of the hotel suite faded away, replaced by the sterile, freezing atmosphere of a fertility clinic waiting room. I could almost smell the sharp sting of rubbing alcohol and bleached floors. I was 28 years old, sitting on a stiff fabric couch, nervously clutching a stack of intake forms. Julian was pacing the hallway outside the frosted glass door. He had been agitated all morning. He hated the clinic. He hated the implication that we even needed to be there. In his world, a man provided, a man conquered, and a man reproduced. The very idea that we were struggling to conceive was a direct insult to his carefully curated image of black excellence and undisputed masculinity. He viewed children not just as family, but as trophies, as tangible proof of his legacy and dominance. When the nurse finally called our names, Julian miraculously received an urgent business call. It was a classic Julian maneuver, designed to avoid vulnerability at all costs. He held up a finger, gesturing for me to go inside without him. He mouthed that he was closing a multi-million-dollar commercial lease and could not hang up the phone. He told me to just get the paperwork and he would join me in a minute. I walked into the doctor's office alone. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had spent the last 2 years tracking my ovulation, taking endless supplements, and quietly enduring my mother. Vivica's passive-aggressive comments about my ticking biological clock. I was fully prepared for the doctor to look me in the eye and tell me my body was broken. The doctor was a kind older woman with gentle eyes. She did not deliver bad news about my reproductive health. Instead, she smiled reassuringly and told me that my tests had come back completely clear. I was perfectly healthy. All my hormone levels were optimal, and my scans showed 0 issues. There was absolutely nothing wrong with my body. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 2 years. Then her expression shifted, settling into a mask of professional sympathy. She opened a secondary file and gently pushed a piece of paper across the heavy wooden desk. It was Julian's analysis. The numbers printed on that crisp white sheet of paper defied everything my husband believed about himself. His sperm count was absolute 0. The doctor explained the medical reality with clinical precision. Based on his detailed medical history, the severe bout of mumps he suffered when he was 14 had caused irreversible complications. The viral infection had resulted in permanent damage to his reproductive system. The condition was absolute and untreatable. Julian was completely sterile. He would never be able to father a child naturally. I sat in that chair, staring at the black ink on the page, until the letters blurred together into a meaningless shape. The silence in the doctor's office was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of a wall clock. I thought about the man pacing out in the hallway. I thought about how Julian's entire identity was wrapped up in his pride. He built his self-worth on being the alpha male, the provider, the untouchable force in any room he entered. He masked his deep-rooted insecurities with loud, arrogant bravado and expensive suits. If I walked out there and handed him that piece of paper, it would not just break his heart. It would absolutely destroy him. He would crumble under the weight of his own perceived inadequacy. He would view himself as less than a man in a society that already placed impossible pressures on black men. He would spiral into a dark, bottomless pit of shame, and he would inevitably drag our marriage down with him. I loved him too much to let that happen. I thanked the doctor, took the manila envelope, and asked if I could use the private restroom attached to her office before I left. She nodded, understanding the need for a moment of private processing. I locked the bathroom door behind me and leaned against the cold porcelain sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I held the medical report in my trembling hands. I had a choice to make in that tiny, sterile room. I could tell the truth and watch my husband's ego shatter into a million jagged pieces, or I could protect him at my own expense. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small lighter, the one I kept for lighting culinary torches in my test kitchen. I held the edge of the medical report over the sink and flicked the metal wheel. The flame caught the paper instantly. I watched Julian's sterility diagnosis burn, turning from stark white truth into fragile gray ash. The fire consumed the medical jargon, the 0% count, and the definitive conclusion of his infertility. I washed the remnants down the drain, watching the water carry the ashes away until the porcelain was perfectly clean. I was erasing the evidence completely, making a silent vow to carry this burden alone. When I walked out into the hallway, Julian was just slipping his phone back into his pocket. He asked me what the doctor said, crossing his arms over his chest, defensive and expectant. He was bracing for a blow to his ego. I looked him dead in the eye and I lied to the man I loved. I told him the problem was me. I told him my tests showed severe complications and that getting pregnant naturally would be nearly impossible. I watched his shoulders relax immediately. I watched the tension melt out of his jaw. The relief that washed over his face was unmistakable and deeply painful to witness. He pulled me into a hug, murmuring that we would figure it out, that we had other things to focus on, like building our businesses. But I felt the subtle shift in his posture, the quiet internal validation that his manhood was intact, and that the failure belonged entirely to me. For 7 long years I carried that lie. I wore the label of the barren wife like a heavy invisible cloak that weighed down my every step. I sat through countless Sunday family dinners biting my tongue while Vivica praised Jasmine's vibrant youth and made pointed comments about my empty nursery. I endured the sympathetic head tilts from Julian's friends and the subtle judgment from his extended family. I let Julian play the role of the noble, supportive husband who chose to stay with a flawed woman. Whenever the topic of children came up, he would put a comforting hand on my knee and tell people we were focusing on our careers, absorbing their admiration for his loyalty. I sacrificed my own reputation and my own peace of mind to shield a man from a truth he was simply too weak to handle. I absorbed the stigma of infertility in the Black community, where motherhood is so often treated as a woman's ultimate crowning achievement. I did it because I believed that protecting your partner was the highest form of love. And tonight that same man stood in my foyer with his arm around my younger sister, condemning me for the very sacrifice that protected him. He looked me in the eye and told me he was tired of a barren home. He told me he was finally getting his twin boys, fulfilling his desperate need for a legacy. He threw me away for a woman who was carrying children he believed were his own flesh and blood. But Julian was irreversibly sterile. There was absolutely no medical possibility that those twins belonged to him. Jasmine was carrying another man's children, and she was using my husband as her wealthy, oblivious mark. I opened my eyes, bringing myself back to the present reality of the penthouse suite. A slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. Julian thought he had won. He thought he had discarded a broken wife for a fertile, vibrant new family. He had no idea he was walking into a vicious trap set by a desperate sister, and he was about to discover the devastating truth on his own. The stage was perfectly set. It was time for his own mother to shatter the glass house he had built for himself. While I was sitting in my penthouse meticulously dismantling Julian's financial life piece by piece, my soon-to-be ex-husband was busy orchestrating his own social execution. I would not witness the events of that Sunday afternoon firsthand, but his mother Loretta would recount every single humiliating detail to me later. She would describe the scene with the precise, sharp clarity of a woman who had just watched her own son willingly walk off a cliff. Sunday dinner at Loretta's house was a long-standing, unshakable tradition. Her home in Decatur was filled with the rich, heavy scents of smothered cabbage, candied yams, and fried chicken. Loretta was a proud, no-nonsense matriarch who commanded respect the moment you walked through her front door. She had raised Julian as a single mother, working double shifts to ensure he had every opportunity to succeed. She taught him the value of hard work and integrity. But over the years, she watched with growing disappointment as he traded those values for custom-tailored suits and arrogant bravado. Loretta and I had always shared a quiet mutual respect. She saw right through Julian's flashy exterior and knew exactly who was holding him together. She knew I paid for the extravagant anniversary trips he claimed to surprise her with. She knew I was the quiet force behind his loud success. More importantly, she possessed a fierce protective loyalty to the truth. So when her front door opened that Sunday afternoon and Julian walked in, not with me, but with my younger sister Jasmine, Loretta felt an immediate icy wave of disgust. Julian marched into his mother's house beaming with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had just conquered the world. He had one hand resting possessively on Jasmine's lower back, guiding her into the living room as if she were a fragile, priceless prize. Jasmine was wearing a modest floral maternity dress, playing the role of the sweet, respectful future daughter-in-law. She carried a store-bought peach cobbler, offering it to Loretta with a bright, practiced smile. Loretta did not take the pie. She stood in the hallway, wiping her hands on her apron, staring at Jasmine's visibly rounded stomach, and then looking up at her son. Julian did not look ashamed of parading his pregnant mistress into his mother's home. He looked triumphant. He pulled Jasmine closer and announced that they were starting a new chapter. He told his mother that he and I were getting a divorce, and that Jasmine was about to give him the family he had always deserved. Loretta told me later that the sheer audacity of his words temporarily robbed her of speech. She simply turned around and walked back into the kitchen, leaving them standing awkwardly in the foyer. Jasmine tried to follow her, attempting to bridge the gap by offering to help set the table. Loretta stopped her with a single freezing look, telling her that guests do not touch her good china. The message was clear. Jasmine was not family. She was an intruder. The atmosphere in the dining room was suffocatingly tense. Julian took his usual seat at the head of the table, acting as if nothing was out of the ordinary. He piled his plate high with food, completely oblivious to the dark storm brewing in his mother's eyes. He believed that the impending arrival of his children would instantly erase the sting of his infidelity. In his mind, providing a new generation was the ultimate trump card that excused any collateral damage along the way. As they ate, Julian began his grand monologue. He leaned back in his chair, puffing out his chest, and spoke about his legacy. He talked about how a man of his ambition needed sons to carry on his name. He boasted about the twin boys growing inside Jasmine, describing how he was going to teach them to be strong, successful black men who commanded respect in the business world. He spoke with the blind arrogance of a king surveying an empire, completely unaware that the ground beneath his throne was already crumbling into dust. Loretta sat at the opposite end of the table, her plate completely untouched. She listened to her son brag about his virility and his future. But Loretta possessed a secret that made Julian's boastful speech sound like the frantic ravings of a madman. She knew the absolute truth about his medical history. She remembered the terrifying week when Julian was 14 years old, burning with a fever from a severe bout of the mumps. She remembered sitting in the pediatrician's office, hearing the doctor explain that the infection had caused permanent, irreversible complications. Loretta knew without a shadow of a doubt that Julian was completely sterile. She sat there watching Jasmine delicately touch her pregnant belly, smiling softly at Julian's grand declarations. Loretta realized in that moment that she was sitting across from a predator. Jasmine was carrying another man's children and sitting in Loretta's dining room, letting Julian claim them as his own. Loretta realized that Jasmine had targeted her son, played on his deep-rooted insecurities, and manipulated him into destroying his marriage. But what horrified Loretta even more than Jasmine's deception was Julian's treatment of me. Instead of being grateful for the years of loyalty I had given him, Julian decided to use his newfound fatherhood as a weapon to tear me down. He pushed his luck entirely too far. He looked across the table at his mother and attempted to justify his betrayal by insulting my character. Julian shook his head and let out a harsh, dismissive sigh. He told Loretta that he had suffered in silence for 9 years, living in a cold, empty house. He claimed I was too focused on my culinary businesses to be a real wife. Then he lowered his voice, delivering the insult that would seal his fate. He called me an empty vessel. He said he needed a real woman to give him sons, and that my inability to provide him with a family was a burden he simply could no longer bear. He painted me as a defective, broken woman who was holding him back from his true potential. I expected his mother to nod in sympathetic agreement. He expected her to validate his cruelty and welcome his pregnant mistress with open arms. He drastically underestimated the woman who raised him. Loretta had watched me endure the subtle jabs about my childlessness at every family gathering for nearly a decade. She had watched me smile gracefully and change the subject, never once lashing out or defending myself. Hearing Julian hurl those insults at me, Loretta suddenly understood the magnitude of what I had done. She realized that I had known about his sterility all along. She realized that I had voluntarily worn the painful, agonizing label of the barren wife for 9 years just to protect his fragile ego from the devastating truth. I had shielded him from the very shame he was now eagerly trying to drown me in. Julian reached out his empty glass, holding it toward his mother, expecting her to refill his sweet tea. He was still smiling, still completely wrapped in his own delusion of triumph. Loretta did not reach for the pitcher. Her hands rested flat against the polished wood of the dining table. The heavy, suffocating silence stretched across the room, drowning out the sound of the ceiling fan above them. She slowly turned her gaze toward Jasmine, staring at the rounded curve of her stomach with a look of absolute unmasked horror and pity. She let her eyes linger on the physical evidence of Jasmine's deception before shifting her gaze back to her son. Loretta glared at Julian with a fierce, burning disappointment that stripped away every ounce of his arrogant bravado in a single terrifying instant. Loretta stood up from the heavy oak dining table. The sudden scraping of her chair against the hardwood floor cut through Julian's arrogant laughter like a gunshot. She did not reach for the pitcher of sweet tea. She did not offer Jasmine a second helping of candied yams. Instead, she looked down at the woman sitting in my chair, rubbing a pregnant belly that was built on a foundation of absolute deceit. Loretta pointed a firm, steady finger at my younger sister. She ordered Jasmine to stay seated right where she was and not to move a single muscle. Then she turned her piercing gaze to her son. She demanded Julian step into the kitchen with her immediately. Julian let out a loud, irritated sigh. He rolled his eyes, acting like a put-upon king dealing with an unreasonable subject. He patted Jasmine's hand, offering her a patronizingly reassuring smile before pushing his chair back. He followed his mother through the swinging wooden door into the kitchen, expecting a minor scolding about his lack of tact. He thought his mother was simply being sentimental about his divorce from me. He had absolutely no idea he was walking into a slaughterhouse. The heavy kitchen door swung shut behind them, cutting off the sounds of the dining room. The space smelled of cinnamon and baked apples, but the atmosphere between them was freezing cold. Julian immediately went on the defensive. He crossed his arms over his custom-tailored suit and leaned against the counter. He asked his mother what her problem was and why she was looking at his new woman with such blatant disrespect. He told her she needed to get on board with the new program. He puffed out his chest and doubled down on his delusions of grandeur. He boasted about his virility and his supposed massive success. He told Loretta that he was a powerful black man building an empire, and an empire required heirs. He claimed he was finally stepping up to be the patriarch he was always meant to be. He dared to complain about my alleged defects again, telling his mother that he had wasted his prime years waiting on a woman whose body was broken. He said Jasmine was a blessing, who was finally giving him the twin boys that would cement his legacy. Loretta listened to him ramble. She watched him parade his toxic ego around her kitchen, desperately trying to convince himself of his own supremacy. When he finally ran out of breath, she did not yell. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. She asked him point-blank what kind of fool he was playing. She stepped closer to him, invading his space and forcing him to look her in the eye. She told him to stop puffing his chest out like a proud rooster because he was embarrassing himself. Then she shattered his reality into dust. She dropped the truth bomb with surgical precision. She asked him a question that made the blood drain entirely from his face. "Wait, Camille never told you." Julian frowned, his arrogant expression faltering. He asked what I was supposed to have told him. Loretta did not hesitate. She told him that when he had that severe bout of mumps at 14, it caused permanent complications. She laid out the medical reality, without sugarcoating a single syllable. She told him he was completely, irreversibly sterile. She informed him that she had the original pediatric medical records locked away in her fireproof safe upstairs. Julian stopped breathing. He stared at his mother, his mind completely stalling as her words violently collided with his reality. For a brief second, the truth flickered in his eyes. But his ego was too massive, and his insecurities were too deep to accept such a catastrophic blow. The walls of his delusion immediately went up in self-defense. He let out a loud, frantic laugh, shaking his head and stepping away from the counter. He accused his mother of lying. He accused her of making up a ridiculous story just to protect my feelings, because she had always favored me. He shouted that she was just a bitter old woman trying to ruin his happiness out of loyalty to a barren ex-wife. He pointed toward the swinging kitchen door. He loudly declared that the proof of his manhood was sitting right out there in the dining room. He said Jasmine was carrying his twin boys, and no fabricated story about a childhood illness was going to take that away from him. Loretta did not flinch at his shouting. She did not back down. She stood her ground and let the full weight of her disappointment crash down on him. She shook her head slowly, telling him he was the most pathetic excuse for a man she had ever seen. She explained exactly what the doctors had told her decades ago. She recounted the bleak, sterile hospital hallway where the pediatrician pulled her aside while Julian was sleeping off the fever. The doctor had been unequivocal. The viral infection had destroyed his reproductive capabilities permanently. There was no medical miracle waiting in the wings. There was no late-in-life recovery. His sperm count was absolute zero. As a single black mother who had sacrificed everything to build a strong foundation for her son, Loretta had carried the heavy burden of that medical secret for decades, waiting for the right time to help him navigate it. Loretta then connected the dots aloud, forcing Julian to hear the magnitude of my sacrifice. She told him she had assumed we found out at a fertility clinic years ago and simply decided to keep it a secret. She said she thought I was standing by his side out of love, choosing a childless life, rather than making him feel inadequate. But hearing him brag and hurl insults at me, Loretta realized the stunning truth. She told Julian that I must have gone into that clinic, seen his devastating test results, and chosen to take the blame entirely on myself. She told him that I had worn the shame of infertility for 9 years. I had endured the pity, the gossip, and his own cruel resentment just to protect his fragile masculinity from the truth. She looked at her son with tears of angry disappointment in her eyes. She told him he had been sheltered by a queen, a strong, brilliant woman who held up his entire world. And he repaid that profound loyalty by throwing her away for a scavenger. Loretta moved closer, delivering the final crushing blow. She told him that the woman sitting at her dining table was playing him for an absolute fool. She told him those babies growing inside Jasmine belonged to someone else, and that Jasmine had targeted the most arrogant, gullible mark she could find to foot the bill. Julian clamped his hands over his face, rubbing his eyes as if he could physically wipe away the words she was speaking. He refused to listen. He refused to accept that his entire identity as a dominant provider and patriarch was a fabricated illusion. He shouted that Loretta was crazy, and that my wealth had somehow bought her loyalty. He accused her of betraying her own flesh and blood for a daughter-in-law who could not even perform her basic biological duties. I told her she was dead to him, and that he was leaving with his new family. He stormed toward the kitchen door, his breathing heavy and erratic. He pushed his way back into the dining room, desperate to escape the suffocating truth of his mother's kitchen. He wanted to grab Jasmine, walk out the front door, and pretend none of this had ever happened. He wanted to go back to his custom-built house and live in his beautiful lie. But as Julian stepped back into the dining room, the heavy wooden door swinging shut behind him, his mother's words echoed relentlessly in his skull. The seed of paranoia had been violently planted deep within his mind. He could not unhear the absolute, terrifying certainty in Loretta's voice. He could not ignore the logical, horrifying puzzle pieces clicking together in his brain. My quiet resignation in the foyer, the way I signed the divorce papers without shedding a single tear, the way I packed my bag and walked out without fighting for my home. It did not look like the defeat of a broken, barren woman. It looked like the calm, calculated exit of a woman who knew a devastating secret. He looked at Jasmine sitting at the table. She was completely unaware of the execution that had just taken place in the next room. She was happily eating a second serving of candied yams, but her other hand was hidden beneath the table holding her cell phone. Julian watched her fingers moving rapidly, tapping out secret messages she thought no one could see. For the first time, he did not look at her and see an innocent, loving partner. He looked at her and saw a stranger. He saw the shadows of deceit lingering around her bright smile. The arrogant triumph he had felt just an hour ago was entirely gone, replaced by a creeping, sickening dread that was beginning to swallow him whole. Loretta told me she watched Julian stand frozen in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room. His mind was violently rejecting the truth she had just handed him. He stared at Jasmine, but his brain was scrambling desperately, trying to rebuild the fortress of his ego that had just been leveled. He told himself that his mother was simply lying. He tried to convince himself that Loretta was so fiercely loyal to me that she would invent a sickening medical lie just to punish him for the divorce. He gripped the wooden doorframe tight enough to turn his knuckles white, telling himself over and over that he was a virile, powerful man, and that the twin boys growing in the next room were undeniably his own. But the seed of paranoia had already been planted in the dark, fertile soil of his deep-rooted insecurities. And once that seed took root, it grew with terrifying speed. Julian tried to shake off the creeping dread. He forced his shoulders to relax and stepped fully back into the dining room, plastering a rigid, unnatural smile across his face. He walked back to his seat at the head of the table, but the heavy wooden chair suddenly felt like an interrogation hot seat. He sat down and watched Jasmine, really watched her. For the past 4 months he had looked at her through the blinding lens of his own arrogance. He had seen a beautiful, vibrant younger woman who worshipped the ground he walked on. He had seen a willing vessel for his legacy. But now, looking through the cracked glass of his shattered ego, he saw something entirely different. I saw a woman greedily devouring a plate of candied yams and fried chicken, completely unbothered by the suffocating tension in the room. He watched the way her eyes darted around the space, calculating and sharp. Jasmine did not possess the soft, nurturing glow of a mother-to-be. She carried the restless, frantic energy of a survivor who was constantly looking over her shoulder. Julian stared at the rounded curve of her stomach. The twins. His boys. He tried to calculate the timeline in his head. He tried to remember the exact week they had first crossed the line from a flirtatious emotional affair into a physical one. It had been quick. Jasmine had been so eager, so overwhelmingly available. At the time, Julian had flattered himself, believing his charm and success were simply irresistible. Now the horrifying thought crept into his mind that her eagerness was not driven by passion but by sheer desperate necessity. The absolute silence in the dining room was suddenly broken by a sharp, persistent buzzing sound. It was Jasmine's cell phone. It was sitting on the table right next to her plate, facing upward. The screen illuminated, flashing a preview of a text message. Before Julian could even register the name on the screen, Jasmine dropped her fork and snatched the device with lightning speed. Her reflexes were entirely too fast for a woman who had nothing to hide. She pressed the power button to black out the screen and immediately flipped the phone face down onto the polished wood of the dining table. She let out a breathy, nervous laugh and offered Julian a sweet, apologetic smile. She told him it was just some of her girlfriends from Chicago checking in on her. She claimed they were already buzzing about planning a massive luxury baby shower, and she did not want the group chat to distract from their special Sunday dinner. Julian nodded slowly, but he felt a cold bead of sweat roll down the back of his neck. Jasmine's excuse was perfectly plausible on the surface. But Julian was a commercial real estate broker who made his living reading people negotiating deals and spotting liars across a boardroom table. He recognized the subtle telltale signs of deception. Her voice had pitched up half an octave. Her shoulders were stiff. She was gripping the edge of the table with her free hand, her knuckles pale against the dark wood. Loretta sat at the opposite end of the table, silently sipping a glass of water. She did not say a word. She did not have to. She just watched her son slowly drown in his own manufactured nightmare. 10 minutes passed. Julian tried to force down a bite of food, but his stomach was tied in agonizing knots. Then the phone buzzed again. The harsh vibrating sound vibrated against the table, vibrating straight into Julian's frayed nerves. This time Jasmine did not reach for the phone immediately. She let it buzz, trying to act casual, pretending she was entirely focused on her meal. But Julian saw her eyes dart toward the face-down device. He saw the subtle twitch in her jaw. He placed his fork down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He kept his voice deceptively calm, smooth, and low. He asked her if she needed to take that. He suggested that if her friends were so eager to reach her, maybe she should step outside and give them a quick call to settle the baby shower plans. Jasmine swallowed hard, quickly shaking her head. She insisted it was nothing important. She reached out and slid the phone off the table, dropping it carelessly into her designer handbag which sat on the floor beside her chair. She smiled at him again, but the smile did not reach her eyes. She told him he was the only thing she wanted to focus on today. It was the exact kind of syrupy, ego-stroking line that Julian usually ate up. Normally, he would have puffed out his chest and basked in her undivided attention. But the flattering words tasted like pure ash in his mouth. Julian's eyes drifted down to her handbag. Even buried under her makeup bags and wallet, the phone buzzed a third time, a muffled, muted vibration that sounded like a ticking time bomb. Jasmine's hand crept down under the table, resting near the open zipper of her bag. Julian watched her fingers twitch. He realized she was silently desperate to check that screen. He realized she was guarding that device like it held the secrets to the universe. And in that moment, the very last pillar of his arrogant triumph completely collapsed. The heavy foundation of his supremacy began to crack under the unbearable, crushing weight of suspicion. The absolute certainty that had defined his entire adult life was gone. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, and he realized he did not know her at all. He realized he had invited a stranger into his life, handed her the keys to his kingdom, and thrown away the only woman who had ever truly protected him. I thought about my face in the foyer just a few hours ago. He thought about how calm I was. He remembered the steady, fluid motion of my hand as I signed those divorce papers without shedding a single tear. It did not make sense. Unless Loretta was telling the absolute truth. Unless I had known about his sterility for 9 years and had quietly borne the shame of a barren wife to shield a man who was now tearing me down. Julian felt a sudden violent wave of nausea wash over him. The room felt entirely too hot. The rich smells of the Sunday dinner suddenly made his stomach heave. He abruptly pushed his chair back from the table, the legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. He told Jasmine he needed to use the restroom and walked quickly down the hallway, locking the door behind him. He gripped the edges of the bathroom sink, leaning his weight against the cold porcelain. He stared at his reflection in the mirror above the vanity. The man looking back at him was not the untouchable, powerful titan he had imagined himself to be. He looked pale, terrified, and pathetic. His custom-tailored suit felt like a suffocating straitjacket. He turned on the cold water and splashed it over his face, desperately trying to wake up from what felt like an endless waking nightmare. He needed to know for sure. He could not live in this agonizing state of limbo, wondering if his mother was a vindictive liar, or if his entire life was a pathetic joke. He needed absolute, irrefutable medical proof. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He opened his web browser and frantically searched for independent fertility clinics in the greater Atlanta area. He found a high-end private facility that advertised expedited same-day testing results for premium clients. He did not care about the cost. He needed answers, and he needed them the very next morning. I booked the earliest available appointment for Monday morning, locking in an 8 a.m. slot. He stared at the confirmation screen, the bright pixels burning into his retinas. He knew that walking into that clinic tomorrow would either vindicate his manhood and prove his mother wrong, or it would completely destroy his entire existence. He took a deep, shuddering breath and wiped his face with a hand towel. He had to go back out there. He had to walk back into that dining room, sit across from Jasmine, and pretend that he was still the king of the world. He had to swallow his rising panic and play the role of the proud, expectant father for one more night. As Julian slowly made his way down the hallway, his mind could not stop drifting back to me. For the first time in 9 years, he actually considered what my life had been like. He thought about the family holidays where my mother Vivica would corner me in the kitchen, demanding to know when I was going to give her a grandchild. He remembered standing right there sipping a beer and letting me stammer out an awkward excuse about being focused on my culinary group. He remembered how his own friends would make crude jokes about his supposedly defective wife and how he had nodded along playing the tragic hero. He had allowed me to be the scapegoat. He had actively participated in my humiliation. If Loretta's medical records were real, then I was not a broken woman. I was a martyr. I had built a massive, successful business empire while carrying the secret of his ultimate failure. The sheer magnitude of my loyalty was something he could not even begin to comprehend because he possessed none of it himself. He stopped at the edge of the dining room. Loretta was still sitting at the head of the table, her eyes locked onto him with a fierce, unyielding judgment. Jasmine was sipping her water, looking entirely innocent and perfectly content. Julian stared at Jasmine's designer handbag resting on the floor, hiding the phone that kept vibrating with secret messages from unknown men. Julian forced his legs to move. He took his seat back at the table. He did not speak. The meal concluded in a heavy, suffocating silence. He was a man suspended over a terrifying abyss, waiting for the harsh, sterile light of a medical clinic to finally cut the rope. I would later learn every pathetic, humiliating detail of his Monday morning. Julian barely survived the rest of that Sunday evening after leaving Loretta's house. He drove Jasmine back to the custom-built estate I had paid for, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his hands ached. Jasmine slept in the passenger seat, her designer handbag clutched protectively against her chest, even in her sleep. He lay awake. Every time she shifted or her phone lit up on the nightstand, a fresh wave of bile rose in his throat. Monday morning arrived with a heavy, oppressive humidity. Julian slipped out of bed before the sun was fully up. He did not bother putting on his usual custom-tailored suit. He threw on a simple pair of jeans and a dark hoodie, feeling like a man walking to his own execution. He drove across Atlanta to the private independent fertility clinic he had frantically researched the day before. The high-end facility promised absolute discretion and immediate results for clients willing to pay an exorbitant premium. Julian slapped his platinum credit card on the marble reception desk. He demanded the rapid testing protocol, refusing to sit down in the plush waiting area. The receptionist guided him down a pristine white hallway that smelled sharply of bleach and rubbing alcohol. It was the exact same clinical scent I had breathed in 7 years ago when I chose to burn his devastating truth to ash. The process was humiliating for a man whose entire identity revolved around dominance and control. He was ushered into a sterile private room, handed a plastic cup, and told to ring a bell when he was finished. Julian stared at the blank white walls, feeling completely stripped of his power. He went through the degrading motions, his mind entirely blank. When he handed the sample back to the clinical technician, he felt a profound, sickening hollowness in his chest. I was instructed to wait in a private consultation office while the rapid analysis was performed. The ticking of the wall clock echoed in the small room, sounding like a heavy gavel striking a wooden block over and over. Julian sat in a stiff leather chair, his leg bouncing uncontrollably. He tried to summon his usual arrogant bravado. He tried to tell himself that his mother Loretta was just a bitter woman trying to manipulate him. He tried to convince himself that the clinic would come back with glowing numbers proving his absolute virility. But the memory of Jasmine desperately guarding her vibrating phone under the dining table kept flashing in his mind. The terrifying certainty in his mother's eyes refused to fade. 20 minutes later, the heavy wooden door opened. A male doctor in a crisp white coat walked in holding a single sheet of paper. He did not offer a warm, reassuring smile. He sat down behind the desk, folded his hands, and looked at Julian with professional, detached sympathy. The doctor pushed the paper across the desk. Julian snatched it up, his eyes darting frantically across the medical jargon. He was looking for the numbers. He was looking for the confirmation of his manhood. His eyes locked onto the final conclusion, absolute zero. Julian stopped breathing. The air was violently sucked out of the room. He stared at the bold black ink spelling out his total irreversible failure. He asked the doctor if there was a mistake. He demanded they run the test again, claiming he had paid for premium service and their equipment must be faulty. The doctor shook his head slowly. He explained that the results were definitive. He pointed out the physical markers in the analysis, confirming severe bilateral testicular atrophy consistent with a profound post-viral complication. The doctor asked if Julian had ever suffered from a severe case of the mumps during puberty. The confirmation hit Julian with the force of a freight train. The doctor's words perfectly mirrored the exact truth Loretta had dropped on him in her kitchen the day before. There was no mistake. There was no medical anomaly. His mother had told the absolute horrifying truth. He was completely and entirely sterile. Julian dropped the piece of paper onto the desk. His hands were trembling violently. The arrogant, untouchable facade he had worn for his entire adult life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The suffocating icy dread he had been fighting off since Sunday afternoon fully consumed him. He was a hollow, empty shell of a man. The legacy he had boasted about, the bloodline he thought he was creating, it was all a pathetic delusion. He sat in the chair staring at the wall as the sheer magnitude of the situation began to crush him. If he was sterile, then the twin boys growing inside Jasmine did not belong to him. She had looked him dead in the eye, kissed him, and told him he was going to be a father while carrying the children of another man. She had used his desperate need for a legacy to secure her own financial survival. She was playing him for an absolute fool. But the betrayal from Jasmine paled in comparison to the devastating epiphany that followed. If Julian had been sterile since he was 14 years old, then our entire 9-year struggle with infertility was never my fault. Julian remembered the day we went to our own fertility clinic 7 years ago. He remembered pacing the hallway, taking a business call, because he was too terrified to face the doctor. He remembered me walking out of the office, looking him in the eye and telling him my body was broken. He remembered the overwhelming rush of relief he felt knowing his manhood was intact and that the failure belonged entirely to me. Now sitting in a nearly identical clinic room, the horrifying truth finally dawned on him. I had never been broken. I was perfectly healthy. I had walked into that doctor's office 7 years ago, seen his devastating 0% sperm count, and made a conscious choice to protect him. I had taken the medical report and destroyed it. I had walked out into the hallway and willingly draped the agonizing heavy cloak of infertility over my own shoulders just to shield his fragile ego from being destroyed. The memories of his cruelty rushed back to haunt him with agonizing clarity. He thought about every Sunday dinner where he let his extended family whisper about my inability to give him a child. He thought about how he would place a comforting hand on my knee, playing the loyal, noble husband who chose to stay with a defective wife. He remembered how I would smile gracefully and change the subject, absorbing the humiliation in complete silence. I had endured nearly a decade of pity and judgment to protect the pride of a man who was entirely unworthy of my loyalty. I thought about Vivian and Terrence, my own parents. He remembered how they constantly favored Jasmine, how they praised her for simply existing while taking my financial support for granted. Julian realized that he had actively joined them in their cruelty. When Vivica would make pointed remarks about a woman's true purpose being motherhood, Julian had simply nodded along. He had let my own mother belittle me, knowing deep down that he was the one who could not perform. He had allowed me to be the scapegoat for his biological failure. And how had he repaid that profound, unthinkable sacrifice? He had brought my younger sister into the custom-built home I paid for. He had wrapped his arm around her pregnant belly, looked at the woman who had sacrificed her entire reputation for him, and told her he was tired of living in a barren house. He had looked me up and down and coldly declared that he had simply married the wrong sister. He had discarded a queen who protected his entire world for a scavenger who was using him as a blind, wealthy mark. He realized the sheer magnitude of the bullet Jasmine had dodged with her ex-husband Liam. Liam had kicked her out and cut her off completely because he discovered she was a manipulative, cheating predator. Jasmine had scrambled to find a new host to maintain her lavish lifestyle, and she had targeted Julian because he was loud, flashy, and deeply insecure. She knew a man with an ego that large would be incredibly easy to manipulate. She sold him a fairy tale about his virility and his legacy, and he bought it completely. A guttural sound escaped Julian's throat. It was a miserable, wretched noise of pure self-hatred. He grabbed the edges of the doctor's desk, his knuckles turning stark white as he struggled to remain upright in the chair. He had willingly destroyed a marriage with a woman who had quietly bankrolled his life and protected his deepest flaws. He had traded unparalleled devotion for a cheap, deceitful illusion. He wanted to scream. He wanted to punch the wall until his hands bled. He had nothing left but the crushing realization that he was the architect of his own absolute destruction. Julian stumbled out of the clinic in a complete daze. The bright Atlanta morning sun felt harsh and blinding. He walked to his leased sports car and collapsed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until his hands went numb. He stared blankly at the dashboard, trying to figure out how to navigate the wreckage of his life. He needed to confront Jasmine. He needed to rip the truth out of her and kick her out of his house. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, intending to call her. But before he could even dial her number, the screen illuminated with a flurry of urgent, high-priority notifications. They were automated alerts from his commercial banking portal. He stared at the screen, his heart dropping entirely into his stomach. The icy dread that had consumed his personal life was about to violently crash into his professional empire. My chief financial officer executed the final phase of my directive precisely at 9 in the morning. I was sitting at the heavy mahogany desk in my penthouse suite, sipping a freshly brewed espresso and watching the digital confirmations light up my laptop screen. Miles away, sitting in the sweltering driver's seat of his leased sports car, Julian was about to experience a completely different kind of digital awakening. He had just walked out of the fertility clinic with the agonizing medical proof that his manhood was a biological illusion. His entire reality had been shattered by the realization that Jasmine was carrying another man's children and that I had sacrificed my own reputation for nearly a decade just to protect his fragile ego. I was gripping his phone, his thumb hovering over Jasmine's contact name. He was vibrating with a violent, desperate rage. He wanted to call the woman sleeping in my custom-built house and scream until his lungs gave out. He wanted to rip the truth out of her and throw her back out onto the street where she belonged. But before his thumb could press the call button, his phone screen shifted. The call interface was violently pushed aside by a cascading waterfall of high-priority automated alerts. Julian stared blankly at the screen as the notifications piled up in rapid succession. The first was a stark red banner from his primary commercial bank. It read that his corporate accounts were immediately frozen, pending a review of guarantor withdrawal. A second later, another alert popped up from his automated payroll processing company. It stated that the scheduled biweekly draft had been completely rejected due to insufficient funds. Then came an email notification from the management company that leased his ultra-modern downtown office space. The message warned that his monthly rent payment had bounced and a default notice was being issued. The suffocating, icy dread that had consumed his personal life just 10 minutes ago violently crashed into his professional empire. Julian forgot about Jasmine. He forgot about the fake twins and the catastrophic medical report sitting on the passenger seat. The sheer animal panic of impending financial ruin hijacked his entire nervous system. He frantically tapped the screen, opening his banking application. He typed in his credentials, his hands shaking so badly he locked himself out on the first attempt. When he finally bypassed the security screen, he was greeted by a devastating wall of gray text. Every single commercial account tied to his real estate firm displayed a balance of 0, access restricted. Julian threw the car into drive, his tires squealing against the asphalt of the clinic parking lot. He sped toward his downtown office, cutting through the heavy Atlanta morning traffic with reckless desperation. He dialed his lead accountant, a man who had spent the last 5 years quietly stressing over Julian's lavish spending habits and flashy lifestyle. The accountant answered on the first ring, sounding completely frantic. Julian demanded to know what was happening and why the bank was locking him out of his own business. The accountant's voice trembled over the line. He explained that their primary angel investor, the Silent Capital Group that provided the massive financial safety net for all of Julian's highly leveraged commercial deals, had unexpectedly and completely withdrawn all funding. The investment group had initiated a total asset freeze, citing a breach of contract clause that triggered an immediate severance of capital. Because Julian's entire firm operated on razor-thin margins and heavily relied on that specific backer to secure secondary loans, the withdrawal caused an instantaneous, devastating domino effect. The bank panicked and froze everything to mitigate their own exposure. Julian swerved into the parking garage of his office building, nearly clipping a concrete pillar. He screamed into the phone, demanding to know how an investor could just pull out without a mandatory 90-day notice period. He insisted he was a titan of the industry and that he had ironclad legal protections against this exact kind of sabotage. The accountant went dead silent on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was dripping with absolute pity. He reminded Julian that he had never actually read the fine print of the capital agreements. Julian had always been too arrogant, too focused on the flashy networking events and the ribbon-cutting ceremonies, to bother with the tedious legal mechanics of his own funding. Julian hung up on the accountant and sprinted to the elevator. He burst into his lavish corner office, completely ignoring his confused administrative staff. He locked the heavy glass door behind him and dialed his corporate attorney. He paced the length of his expensive office, sweating profusely. When the lawyer answered, Julian ordered him to immediately draft a massive lawsuit against the Angel Investment Group. He demanded the lawyer find out exactly who was sitting on the board of that silent capital firm so he could personally destroy them for ruining his morning. The lawyer asked Julian to calm down, promising to look into the corporate registry and pull the original funding contracts. Julian paced for 15 agonizing minutes. He looked around his beautiful office at the expensive modern art on the walls and the custom leather furniture. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of black excellence. He portrayed himself as a self-made mogul, an untouchable force in the commercial real estate market, who commanded respect and admiration. He needed this office. He needed the leased sports car. Without the money and the status, he was absolutely nothing. His phone rang. Julian snatched it up, demanding good news. The lawyer's voice was low, hesitant, and laced with a profound, terrifying confusion. The lawyer explained that he had just pulled the corporate filings for the Angel Investment Group. He traced the shell corporation back to its primary holding company to find out who was actually pulling the strings. Julian asked for the name, ready to declare war. The lawyer took a deep, slow breath. He told Julian that the Shell Corporation was a direct subsidiary of a high-end national culinary group. He told him that the sole owner, the primary shareholder, and the absolute dictator of that entire financial network was Camille. Julian stopped pacing. His expensive Italian leather shoes felt perfectly glued to the hardwood floor. The phone slipped slightly in his sweaty palm. He asked the lawyer to repeat what he just said, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. The lawyer confirmed the devastating reality. I was the angel investor. I was the Silent Capital Group. I was the invisible, unyielding foundation that had propped up his entire pathetic, failing business for the last 5 years. The absolute magnitude of his humiliation crashed down on him, flattening him completely. He realized that every single deal he bragged about at Sunday dinner, every flashy bonus he claimed he earned, and every ounce of respect he thought he commanded was entirely funded by his quiet, barren wife. He was not a self-made titan. He was a charity case. He was a kept man parading around in a kingdom built entirely by my hard work. I had allowed him to play the powerful patriarch while I silently paid the bills, shielding his massive, fragile ego from the humiliating truth of his own incompetence. Julian's mind reeled, struggling to process the sheer scope of my control. He frantically asked the lawyer how I could legally sever the funds overnight without a massive court battle. He argued that we were still married, and those assets should be protected under marital property laws. The lawyer let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. He asked Julian if he had bothered to read the divorce papers he had filed yesterday. He asked Julian if he actually looked at the expedited separation agreement he had so arrogantly slapped on the kitchen island. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. He remembered the manila envelope. He remembered standing in the foyer with his arm around Jasmine, feeling like a triumphant king. He had demanded I sign the papers to facilitate a clean, immediate break so he could start his new perfect life. He had been so desperate to secure his new family that he had his own legal team draft a brutal, unforgiving asset severance clause. The clause explicitly stated that upon signature, all shared financial liabilities and business entanglements were immediately and irrevocably severed, leaving each party with their respective standalone assets. Julian had designed a legal trap to ensure I could not touch the real estate firm he falsely believed he built. He had set a financial guillotine intended for my neck, and I had calmly picked up my Mont Blanc pen, looked at his smug face, and signed the very document that legally authorized me to pull his life support without warning. I had given him exactly what he arrogantly demanded: an immediate, absolute severance. The lawyer's voice faded into the background as the phone dropped from Julian's hand, clattering onto the hardwood floor. He fell to his knees in the middle of his lavish office. He was bankrupt. He was personally liable for millions in commercial debt that my shell company was previously shielding him from. He had a massive payroll due on Friday that he could not cover. His lease was defaulting. His cars would be repossessed. His entire reputation was about to be publicly and violently destroyed. He had walked into the foyer yesterday as a proud, fertile millionaire discarding a broken woman. In less than 24 hours, he had been brutally stripped of every single delusion he held. He was medically sterile. He was completely penniless. The children he thought were his legacy belonged to another man. And the woman waiting for him back at the house was a desperate, predatory gold digger who was about to realize that the gold mine she thought she secured was completely empty. I would eventually piece together the exact sequence of events that took place in my custom-built house that afternoon. Liam filled in some blanks later, and the sheer devastation written across Julian's face when he finally came crawling back to me filled in the rest. Julian did not stay on his office floor for long. The primal urge to survive forced him onto his feet, but he had nowhere left to run. His commercial real estate firm was effectively dead. His bank accounts were frozen solid. He left his downtown building like a ghost haunting his own life and drove back to the sprawling suburban estate I had paid for. He walked through the heavy mahogany front door, stepping into the cool, quiet foyer where just yesterday he had demanded a divorce. The house was completely silent. He made his way up the curved staircase, his legs feeling like they were made of solid lead. He walked into the master suite and found Jasmine fast asleep on the California king bed. She was sprawled out comfortably, surrounded by the expensive silk pillows I had personally selected. Her designer handbag was tossed carelessly on the floor near the nightstand. Peeking out from the unzipped pocket was her cell phone. Julian stared at the device. He remembered how frantically she had guarded it during Sunday dinner at Loretta's house. He remembered the desperate twitch in her fingers every time the screen illuminated. A sickening wave of adrenaline crashed through his veins. He crept toward the handbag, his heart hammering against his ribs. He carefully pulled the device from the bag. The screen was locked, but Jasmine was a heavy sleeper. He gently picked up her limp hand and pressed her thumb against the home sensor. The phone unlocked with a soft, quiet click. Julian retreated to the master bathroom, locking the door silently behind him. He sat down on the edge of the porcelain soaking tub and opened her messaging application. He did not know exactly what he was looking for, but the icy dread in his stomach told him he would find it. He scrolled past a few superficial conversations with our mother Vivica before hitting a heavily populated thread. The contact name was simply saved as Liam. Julian knew Liam was Jasmine's white ex-husband. He also knew the lie Jasmine had spun about their separation, claiming they simply grew apart and wanted different things. Julian opened the text thread and began to read. The illusion of the sweet, innocent victim was instantly and violently butchered. The messages dated back 4 months, outlining a vicious and completely finalized divorce. Liam did not mince words. He brutally mocked Jasmine for her financial desperation. Julian read a text where Jasmine begged Liam for a temporary cash advance, claiming she could not afford the lease on her luxury apartment. Liam's response was cold and legally bulletproof. He reminded her of the infidelity clause in their prenuptial agreement. I explicitly stated that, because he caught her carrying on multiple affairs with random men around Chicago, she was legally entitled to absolutely nothing. He told her she was entirely cut off and suggested she find another gullible host to fund her shopping habits. Julian stared at the glowing screen, his breath catching in his throat. Jasmine had not left Liam to find her cultural roots or seek a better spiritual match. She had been thrown out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back. She was drowning in debt and entirely desperate for a financial lifeline. But the true nightmare was yet to come. Julian backed out of the conversation with Liam and kept scrolling. He noticed a text thread that was completely muted, hidden deep in her message history. The contact was saved under a single initial, the letter T. Julian opened the thread, and the absolute last shred of his dignity was instantly incinerated. The messages were incredibly explicit, leaving absolutely nothing to the imagination. The man on the other end of the line was a prominent personal trainer Jasmine had been seeing in Chicago. The timeline of the messages perfectly aligned with the end of her marriage to Liam and the beginning of her sudden, overwhelming interest in Julian. Julian read through the horrific digital history of his own manipulation. Jasmine had frantically texted the trainer 3 months ago, sending him a picture of a positive pregnancy test. She demanded that he step up and take financial responsibility. The trainer's response was a masterclass in toxic deflection. He laughed at her demands. He explicitly referred to the twins as his own flesh and blood, but firmly stated he had no intention of paying a single dime in child support. Hai told Jasmine she was a grown woman who played dangerous games, and she needed to figure out how to secure a bag on her own. He actually typed out the words telling her to go find a sucker with deep pockets to foot the bill for his kids. Julian's hands shook so violently, he almost dropped the phone onto the bathroom tiles. He read Jasmine's replies, feeling the bile rise hot and bitter in his throat. She did not defend her honor. She simply pivoted her strategy. Julian watched his own name appear on the screen, typed out by the woman he had just thrown his wife away for. Jasmine bragged to the trainer about her new plan. She called Julian the flashy, arrogant brother-in-law with more money than sense. She detailed exactly how she was going to play on his massive ego and his desperate desire for a legacy. She typed out her entire predatory strategy, mocking Julian for being so incredibly easy to manipulate. She told the trainer that Julian bought the story hook, line, and sinker. She boasted that she had successfully locked down a millionaire who was going to pay for everything, raise another man's twins, and keep her wrapped in designer luxury for the rest of her life. Julian sat in my pristine marble bathroom, reading the exact, undeniable proof of his total destruction. The words on the screen blurred together as hot, angry tears finally spilled over his eyelashes. He was not a conqueror. I was not a powerful patriarch securing his bloodline. He was the sucker. He was the gullible, desperate mark that a bankrupt serial cheater had used to save herself from ruin. I thought about the medical document sitting in his car, confirming his absolute zero sperm count. He thought about his frozen commercial bank accounts and the sudden terrifying reality of his bankruptcy. He had traded a woman who quietly funded his life and protected his deepest, most humiliating secret for nearly a decade, for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a pathetic, easily manipulated wallet. He had looked me in the eye just yesterday and told me I was the wrong sister. He had puffed out his chest and demanded a divorce, feeling like a triumphant king. And in doing so, he had voluntarily walked straight into a trap that stripped him of his money, his pride, his legacy, and his entire future. Julian locked the phone screen and set the device down on the bathroom counter. The silence of the large, empty house pressed in on him, suffocating and heavy. He looked at himself in the vanity mirror. The man staring back was completely broken. There was no arrogant bravado left. There was no flashy charm to hide behind. He was a sterile, bankrupt fool, living in a house owned by the wife he had just betrayed alongside a mistress who despised him. He realized with a chilling absolute certainty that he had only one option left. He had to fix this. He had to go back to the woman he had discarded and beg for his life. He genuinely believed that because I had protected him for 9 years, I still possessed a well of unconditional forgiveness. He thought he could crawl to my feet, explain the horrific deception, and I would simply welcome him back into my protective embrace. He had no idea that the woman he was about to face was no longer his silent martyr. He was about to walk into my corporate headquarters, completely unaware that I was already waiting for him with a financial firing squad. Julian did not stay on the floor of his office for long. The primal urge to survive forced him onto his feet, but he quickly realized he had absolutely nowhere left to run. His commercial real estate firm was effectively dead. His bank accounts were frozen solid. He left his downtown building like a ghost haunting his own life and drove back to the sprawling suburban estate I had paid for. He walked through the heavy mahogany front door, stepping into the cool, quiet foyer, where just yesterday he had demanded a divorce. The house was completely silent. He made his way up the curved staircase, his legs feeling like they were made of solid lead. He walked into the master suite and found Jasmine fast asleep on the California king bed. She was sprawled out comfortably surrounded by the expensive silk pillows I had personally selected. Her designer handbag was tossed carelessly on the floor near the nightstand. Peeking out from the unzipped pocket was her cell phone. Julian stared at the device. He remembered how frantically she had guarded it during Sunday dinner at Loretta's house. He remembered the desperate twitch in her fingers every time the screen illuminated. A sickening wave of adrenaline crashed through his veins. He crept toward the handbag, his heart hammering against his ribs. He carefully pulled the device from the bag. The screen was locked, but Jasmine was a heavy sleeper. He gently picked up her limp hand and pressed her thumb against the home sensor. The phone unlocked with a soft, quiet click. Julian retreated to the master bathroom, locking the door silently behind him. He sat down on the edge of this porcelain soaking tub and opened her messaging application. He did not know exactly what he was looking for, but the icy dread in his stomach told him he would find it. He scrolled past a few superficial conversations with our mother Vivica before hitting a heavily populated thread. The contact name was simply saved as Liam. Julian knew Liam was Jasmine's white ex-husband. He also knew the lie Jasmine had spun about their separation, claiming they simply grew apart and wanted different things. Julian opened the text thread and began to read. The illusion of the sweet innocent victim was instantly and violently butchered. The messages dated back 4 months, outlining a vicious and completely finalized divorce. Liam did not mince words. He brutally mocked Jasmine for her financial desperation. Julian read a text where Jasmine begged Liam for a temporary cash advance, claiming she could not afford the lease on her luxury apartment. Liam's response was cold and legally bulletproof. He reminded her of the infidelity clause in their prenuptial agreement. I explicitly stated that, because he caught her carrying on multiple affairs with random men around Chicago, she was legally entitled to absolutely nothing. He told her she was entirely cut off and suggested she find another gullible host to fund her shopping habits. Julian stared at the glowing screen, his breath catching in his throat. Jasmine had not left Liam to find her cultural roots or seek a better spiritual match. She had been thrown out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back. She was drowning in debt and entirely desperate for a financial lifeline. But the true nightmare was yet to come. Julian backed out of the conversation with Liam and kept scrolling. He noticed a text thread that was completely muted, hidden deep in her message history. The contact was saved under a single initial, the letter T. Julian opened the thread and the absolute last shred of his dignity was instantly incinerated. The messages were incredibly explicit, leaving absolutely nothing to the imagination. The man on the other end of the line was a prominent personal trainer Jasmine had been seeing in Chicago. The timeline of the messages perfectly aligned with the end of her marriage to Liam and the beginning of her sudden, overwhelming interest in Julian. Julian read through the horrific digital history of his own manipulation. Jasmine had frantically texted the trainer 3 months ago, sending him a picture of a positive pregnancy test. She demanded that he step up and take financial responsibility. The trainer's response was a masterclass in toxic deflection. He laughed at her demands. He explicitly referred to the twins as his own flesh and blood, but firmly stated he had no intention of paying a single dime in child support. I told Jasmine she was a grown woman who played dangerous games and she needed to figure out how to secure a bag on her own. He actually typed out the words telling her to go find a sucker with deep pockets to foot the bill for his kids. Julian's hands shook so violently, he almost dropped the phone onto the bathroom tiles. He read Jasmine's replies, feeling the bile rise hot and bitter in his throat. She did not defend her honor. She simply pivoted her strategy. Julian watched his own name appear on the screen typed out by the woman he had just thrown his wife away for. Jasmine bragged to the trainer about her new plan. She called Julian the flashy, arrogant brother-in-law with more money than sense. She detailed exactly how she was going to play on his massive ego and his desperate desire for a legacy. She typed out her entire predatory strategy mocking Julian for being so incredibly easy to manipulate. She told the trainer that Julian bought the story hook, line, and sinker. She boasted that she had successfully locked down a millionaire who was going to pay for everything, raise another man's twins, and keep her wrapped in designer luxury for the rest of her life. Julian sat in my pristine marble bathroom, reading the exact, undeniable proof of his total destruction. The words on the screen blurred together as hot, angry tears finally spilled over his eyelashes. He was not a conqueror. He was not a powerful patriarch securing his bloodline. He was the sucker. He was the gullible, desperate mark that a bankrupt serial cheater had used to save herself from ruin. He thought about the medical document sitting in his car, confirming his absolute zero sperm count. He thought about his frozen commercial bank accounts and the sudden terrifying reality of his bankruptcy. He had traded a woman who quietly funded his life and protected his deepest, most humiliating secret for nearly a decade, for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a pathetic, easily manipulated wallet. He had looked me in the eye just yesterday and told me I was the wrong sister. He had puffed out his chest and demanded a divorce, feeling like a triumphant king. And in doing so, he had voluntarily walked straight into a trap that stripped him of his money, his pride, his legacy, and his entire future. Julian locked the phone screen and set the device down on the bathroom counter. The silence of the large, empty house pressed in on him, suffocating and heavy. He looked at himself in the vanity mirror. The man staring back was completely broken. There was no arrogant bravado left. There was no flashy charm to hide behind. He was a sterile, bankrupt fool, living in a house owned by the wife he had just betrayed alongside a mistress who despised him. He realized with a chilling, absolute certainty that he had only one option left. He had to fix this. He had to go back to the woman he had discarded and beg for his life. He genuinely believed that because I had protected him for 9 years, I still possessed a well of unconditional forgiveness. He thought he could crawl to my feet, explain the horrific deception, and I would simply welcome him back into my protective embrace. He had no idea that the woman he was about to face was no longer his silent martyr. He was about to walk into my corporate headquarters, completely unaware that I was already waiting for him with a financial firing squad. Julian stumbled out of the house, leaving Jasmine asleep and oblivious. He drove like a madman across Atlanta, heading straight for my culinary headquarters. He bypassed the front desk, ignoring the receptionist who tried to stop him. He pushed through the heavy glass doors of my executive suite, looking like a man who had not slept in a week. I expected to find me crying in a corner, mourning the end of our marriage. Instead, he found me sitting at the head of a long mahogany conference table, flanked by my high-powered legal team. The divorce papers he had so arrogantly demanded I sign were sitting in the center of the table, already notarized and officially filed. Julian collapsed onto the floor of my office, falling to his knees in front of my legal team. He began to sob loudly, begging for forgiveness. He told me he knew everything. He told me about his sterility, the frozen accounts, and Jasmine's horrific deception. He pleaded with me to take him back, promising he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. I looked down at the man kneeling on my floor. I did not offer a single ounce of grace. I did not reach out to comfort him. I simply steepled my fingers and looked at him with absolute cold precision. I told him there was no going back. I coldly laid out the finalized divorce terms. Because of the aggressive separation clause he had insisted upon, I was retaining 100% of my assets. I was keeping the culinary group, the investment portfolio, and the custom-built estate. I told him I was leaving him with his failing firm and his insurmountable debt. I watched his face crumple as he realized there was no safety net left. I leaned forward and delivered the final blow. I informed him that his ultimate punishment was not just losing the woman who had protected him for a decade. His ultimate punishment was keeping the sister he chose. Julian dragged himself up from my office floor, a completely destroyed man. He stumbled out of my corporate headquarters, carrying the crushing weight of his finalized ruin. I watched the heavy glass doors close behind him, and I felt nothing but the crisp, clean air of absolute liberation. My legal team gathered the signed divorce documents, placing them neatly into a secure portfolio. The financial execution was complete. The personal severance was absolute. All that remained was the final public reckoning. 2 days later, my parents Vivica and Terence were completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse that had just decimated their false kingdom. They had not yet realized that their credit cards were deactivated or that their club memberships were revoked. They were entirely too busy orchestrating the grandest social performance of their lives. They were throwing a lavish, over-the-top baby shower for Jasmine at one of the most exclusive country clubs in Buckhead. Vivica had spared absolutely no expense for this event, believing of course that my silent culinary empire was still footing the bill for her extravagant lifestyle. She had invited the absolute upper echelon of her elite social circle. The guest list was a carefully curated collection of local politicians, prominent church elders, wealthy business owners, and the wives of prominent doctors. Vivica wanted an audience. She was eager to showcase the miracle twins to the world. She wanted to bask in the reflected glory of her golden child, successfully securing a man she believed to be a wealthy real estate tycoon. For Vivica and Terence, this baby shower was not about celebrating new life. It was a massive, arrogant victory lap. It was their way of proving to their judgmental social circle that Jasmine, the daughter who had dropped out of college and ruined her first marriage to a white architect, was actually the ultimate winner. They wanted to parade her around as the ultimate example of a successful black family securing their legacy. They had no idea that the legacy they were celebrating was a complete and total biological fraud. I did not receive an invitation to this grand affair. I was the inconvenient casualty. I was the discarded barren older sister who was supposed to be hiding in a dark apartment weeping over the sudden tragic end of my marriage. Vivica expected me to swallow my pride and vanish into the shadows so she could spin a polite, socially acceptable narrative about Julian and I simply growing apart. She expected my quiet, dignified compliance. But I had absolutely no intention of hiding. I woke up that Saturday morning and prepared for battle. I did not dress like a grieving widow. I did not choose a soft, unassuming pastel dress to blend into the background. I went to my closet and selected a custom-tailored crimson pantsuit that fit me like a second skin. The color was bold, striking, and unapologetic. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, sharp style that left my face completely open and defiant. I paired the suit with a pair of designer stilettos that sounded like judges' gavels striking marble with every single step. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who owned the world, because I absolutely did. I drove to the country club and handed my keys to the valet. I walked up the sweeping stone steps and approached the grand ballroom. The doors were propped wide open, spilling the sounds of excessive vanity out into the hallway. The room was a sickening display of performative wealth. There were massive, towering arrangements of white orchids on every single table. A live string quartet played classical music in the corner. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres and sparkling cider. In the center of the room, sitting on a literal velvet chair shaped like a throne, was Jasmine. She was wearing a flowing white maternity gown and a delicate floral crown resting on her head. She was laughing loudly, opening extravagant gifts, and soaking up the adoration of the room. Terence was standing near the private bar laughing loudly and handing out expensive cigars to his fraternity brothers, acting like the proud grandfather of a new dynasty. Vivica was floating from table to table, touching arms and flashing her perfect practiced smile, soaking up the endless stream of compliments. I stepped through the double doors and walked into the ballroom. I did not sneak in. I walked straight down the center aisle, my crimson suit acting as a blinding beacon against the sea of soft baby blue and pale pink decorations. The reaction was almost instantaneous. The lively chatter closest to the door abruptly died. The silence rippled across the massive room like a physical wave. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks were slowly placed down on porcelain plates. The string quartet, oblivious to the social earthquake playing out in front of them, continued to drag their bows across their cellos, creating an eerily beautiful soundtrack to my arrival. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my chin held high. I radiated a profound, unbothered success. I was not the broken, discarded wife they had all been whispering about. I was the most powerful person in the room, and my presence alone demanded absolute submission. Jasmine spotted me from her velvet throne. The bright, artificial smile instantly slid off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. She dropped the tiny designer baby shoe she was holding into her lap. Terrence froze at the bar, his cigar suspended halfway to his mouth. But it was Vivica who reacted with the most volatility. She was standing near the front of the room, holding a crystal glass of water. When her eyes locked onto my crimson suit, her polite society facade completely vanished. Her face contorted with a mixture of absolute terror and raw, furious indignation. She realized in a fraction of a second that her perfect, meticulously crafted social performance was in mortal danger. Vivica set her glass down so hard, the water sloshed over the rim. She marched toward me, her heels sinking into the thick, plush carpet, cutting off my path to the center of the room. She closed the distance between us, placing herself directly in front of me, like a frantic guard dog protecting her golden child. She kept her voice low, a harsh, desperate hiss, meant only for my ears, but her body language screamed panic to the entire congregation. She demanded to know what on earth I thought I was doing. She asked me if I had completely lost my mind, coming to this country club uninvited. She told me I had no right to be here, and that I was violating the sanctity of a private family celebration. I looked down at her, my expression completely flat and unmoved. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I simply looked at her as if she were an annoying insect buzzing around my perfectly tailored lapel. My silence only infuriated her more. Vivica's chest heaved as she desperately tried to maintain her composure while simultaneously trying to verbally destroy me. She accused me of being deeply, bitterly jealous. She told me it was pathetic that I could not handle seeing my younger sister achieve the maternal happiness that I had so utterly failed to secure. She actually pointed a shaking finger at my chest and hissed that I was trying to ruin Jasmine's special day out of pure spite because my own home was barren and empty. Vivica took a step closer, invading my personal space, her perfume suffocatingly sweet. She told me that Julian had made his choice, and that a real woman would accept defeat with dignity instead of parading around in a red suit looking for attention. She claimed that Jasmine was giving this family the legacy it deserved, and that my presence was a toxic dark cloud over their miracle. She warned me that if I opened my mouth, she would make sure every single person in our social network knew exactly how defective and unstable I truly was. She promised to ruin my reputation in Atlanta if I dared to take a single step closer to that stage. She told me I was a selfish, vindictive woman who could not stand to see anyone else blessed. She threatened to call the country club security and have me physically dragged out of the building in front of the entire church congregation if I did not turn around and walk out the door right that second. She told me I was embarrassing myself and that I was a complete disappointment to the family name. I stood there letting her exhaust her toxic vocabulary. I let her hurl every single cruel insult she had harbored against me for my entire life. I let the entire room watch her lose her mind while I remained perfectly calm. I watched the elite social circle, the politicians, the doctors, and the church elders craning their necks and whispering behind their hands. They could not hear exactly what Vivica was hissing, but they could clearly see the frantic, desperate nature of her attack. They could see a mother aggressively trying to expel her eldest daughter from a family gathering. Vivica demanded that I leave. She demanded that I walk away and let them celebrate their beautiful lie in peace. She had no idea that I had not come to argue with her. I had not come to fight for my place in a family that had always despised me. I had come to burn the entire building down. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that finally made Vivica stop talking. Her eyes widened slightly as she realized her threats were bouncing off me like rain against a solid brick wall. I was not the obedient, silent daughter anymore. I was the architect of their impending ruin, and the wrecking ball was already in motion. I looked past my frantic mother, locking eyes with Jasmine, who was shrinking back into her velvet throne, gripping the armrests in pure terror. I took a slow, deliberate breath and prepared to deliver the final, absolute execution. I stepped around my frantic mother as if she were nothing more than a piece of misplaced furniture. Vivica grabbed at my sleeve, but I simply shot her a look so sharp she immediately snatched her hand back. I continued my walk toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom, where a microphone stood waiting for the toast. The entire room held its collective breath. You could hear the faint clinking of ice melting in crystal glasses. I climbed the 2 short steps to the stage and adjusted the microphone stand. I looked out over the sea of carefully curated guests. Politicians, church elders, and high society wives stared back at me. They were waiting for a screaming match. They were expecting the bitter Baron's sister to throw a jealous tantrum. I was going to give them an execution instead. I tapped the microphone once. The sharp feedback echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I began to speak with absolute lethal precision. My voice was smooth, conversational, and completely devoid of any hysterical emotion. I welcomed the elite guests to this grand celebration of new life. I told them it was a beautiful occasion, but unfortunately, they had all been invited to a theater production built on a foundation of absolute fraud. Vivica screamed from the floor, ordering the sound technician to cut the microphone. I simply shot a glance at the venue manager, who knew exactly who I was and whose culinary group frequently catered their highest-paying events. The manager quickly signaled the technician to leave the sound system alone. I turned my attention directly to Jasmine, who was sinking so far back into her velvet throne she looked like she was trying to merge with the fabric. I spoke into the microphone, projecting my voice to the farthest corners of the ballroom. I told the congregation that Jasmine had spun a beautiful tale about returning home to her roots after a mutual, respectful separation from her ex-husband Liam. I exposed the fact that her divorce was actually finalized 4 months ago. I revealed the infidelity clause in her prenuptial agreement. I told the entire room that Liam had thrown her out onto the street completely penniless after catching her carrying on multiple affairs with random men across Chicago. Gasps erupted from the tables. Terrence dropped his unlit cigar. Vivica clutched her chest. I did not give them a single second to recover. I told the crowd that Jasmine was drowning in massive credit card debt and desperately needed a wealthy Mark to save her from ruin. She targeted her own sister's husband because she believed he was a millionaire. Then I dropped the heaviest anchor. I announced that the twins she was so proudly displaying did not belong to Julian at all. I revealed the text messages Liam had forwarded me, exposing her affair with a prominent personal trainer. I told the room that the trainer had laughed in her face and told her to go find a sucker with deep pockets to fund his children. Jasmine covered her face with her hands, sobbing loudly and denying everything. She looked toward the doors, desperately waiting for Julian to arrive and defend their honor. She wanted her rich, powerful patriarch to storm in and silence me. I smiled down at her. I told her that her knight in shining armor was not coming to save her because his armor was completely rented. I pivoted my execution from Jasmine's deceit to Julian's fabricated empire. I informed the hushed room that the wealthy commercial real estate broker they all admired was effectively bankrupt. I exposed the reality of his failing business. I told the elite crowd that Julian had not closed a successful independent deal in years. I revealed that the anonymous angel investor keeping his firm afloat, covering his payroll and paying for his leased sports cars, was a shell corporation owned entirely by my culinary brand. I let the truth settle over the room. I announced that as of Thursday night, all financial backing had been permanently severed. Julian's corporate accounts were frozen. His rent was defaulting. He was drowning in millions of dollars of commercial debt. I looked right into Jasmine's terrified, tear-streaked face and told her the ultimate tragedy of her predatory scheme. She had burned her entire life down to steal a man she thought was a king, only to realize she had shackled herself to a peasant who was just as broke as she was. The ballroom was an absolute pandemonium. Church elders were whispering furiously. Wives were frantically texting under the tables. Vivica was hyperventilating, clinging to Terence for support. Jasmine was weeping uncontrollably, her perfect floral crown slipping sideways off her hair. Then, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung wide open. The chaotic noise in the room instantly died down. Julian walked through the doors. He did not look like the arrogant, flashy broker who had demanded a divorce in my foyer 48 hours ago. He looked completely hollowed out. His face was ashen and drawn. He wore a wrinkled suit jacket over a plain t-shirt, looking like a man who had not slept or eaten in days. The crushing weight of his absolute ruin was visible in every single step he took. The guests parted like the Red Sea, allowing him to walk down the center aisle. Jasmine jumped up from her velvet chair. She ran toward him, crying hysterically, begging him to tell everyone I was lying. She reached out to grab his arm, pleading with him to defend their family. Julian did not even look at her. He brushed right past her outstretched hands, leaving her stumbling in the middle of the aisle. He walked up the 2 steps to the stage. He stood right beside me. He did not yell. He did not try to intimidate me. He looked at me with a profound, miserable submission and gently reached out for the microphone. I handed it to him, stepping back to let him finish the destruction he had started. Julian gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles white. He looked out at the room full of people he had spent years trying to impress. He looked at Vivica and Terence, who were staring at him with desperate, pleading eyes. Then he looked down at Jasmine, who was standing frozen in front of the stage. Julian's voice echoed through the ballroom, heavy and completely defeated. He spoke directly into the microphone, verifying every single word I had just said. He publicly confessed that his entire real estate empire was a pathetic illusion, funded entirely by the brilliant, quiet woman he had foolishly betrayed. The crowd murmured in shock as the golden boy of their social circle willingly stripped away his own armor. But Julian was not finished. He reached into the inner pocket of his wrinkled suit jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. He stepped down from the stage and walked slowly over to Jasmine. She reached out to take the envelope, her hands shaking violently. Julian told her to open it. He commanded her to look at the paperwork inside. He announced to the entire congregation what the documents contained. He told the room that the first page was an official certified medical report from an independent fertility clinic. He confessed his deepest, most agonizing secret to the entire world. He admitted that a severe childhood illness had left him with an absolute 0 sperm count since he was 14 years old. He was completely, irreversibly sterile. He turned back to look at me standing on the stage. In front of the politicians, the doctors, and his own former friends, Julian publicly admitted my sacrifice. He confessed that for 9 years I had voluntarily carried the agonizing stigma of infertility just to protect his fragile ego from the devastating truth. He admitted that I had absorbed the pity, the judgment, and the cruel whispers of our community to shield him from feeling like less than a man. And he confessed that he had repaid that unparalleled loyalty by throwing me away for a woman who was playing him for an absolute fool. Jasmine stared at the medical report, the blood entirely draining from her face. She tried to stammer out a lie, tried to claim the clinic made a mistake, but Julian cut her off. He pointed to the second document in the envelope. It was a court-ordered DNA test he had managed to expedite by calling in his very last remaining favor with a local judge. The test proved conclusively that the twins she was carrying shared absolutely no genetic markers with him. Julian looked at the woman he had destroyed his marriage for. The disgust in his eyes was absolute. He told Jasmine she had played a brilliant game, but the game was officially over. He informed her that the house they were currently sleeping in was heavily mortgaged and officially defaulting by the end of the week. He reached into his pocket one final time and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. He slapped it directly against her chest, letting it fall to the floor at her feet. He announced to the silent, horrified ballroom that it was an immediate eviction notice. He told Jasmine she had until Monday morning to pack her bags and vacate the property before the bank seized it. He looked her dead in the eye and told her she was going back to the streets exactly where her ex-husband Liam had left her. The piece of paper fluttered to the thick plush carpet like a dead leaf. For a split second, the entire country club ballroom was trapped in a heavy, suffocating vacuum of silence. Then the absolute chaos erupted. Jasmine stared at the eviction notice lying at her feet, her hands shaking violently. She let out a guttural, humiliating sob and dropped to her knees right in the middle of the center aisle. She reached out toward the tables, begging the elite wives and prominent doctors for help. She expected the network of high society women to rush to her aid and comfort her. Instead, the wealthy women of Atlanta physically recoiled. They pulled their expensive silk dresses away from her, stepping back, as if she carried a highly contagious disease. The glittering facade of the Miracle Twins had instantly mutated into a filthy public scandal, and absolutely no one wanted to be caught in the blast radius. Vivica realized the staggering magnitude of the social slaughter. She pressed the back of her hand to her forehead and executed a perfectly timed, highly dramatic feint. She collapsed backward into Terrence's arms, fully expecting the room to gasp and rush to fan her face. But no one moved. Terrence struggled to hold her up, his face dripping with nervous sweat. He looked desperately toward the private bar where his fraternity brothers were standing. The men who had been slapping his back and smoking his expensive cigars just 20 minutes ago were now turning their backs, quietly setting their crystal glasses down on the counter and walking briskly out of the ballroom. The social execution was absolute and irreversible. I did not stay to watch them clean up the miserable wreckage. I turned on my designer stiletto heels and walked back up the center aisle. The remaining guests parted from me, their eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and profound respect. I walked out the heavy double doors, retrieved my luxury car from the stunned valet, and drove away from the burning ashes of my former life. News travels with terrifying speed in our city. The public spectacle at the country club was the final nail in Jasmine's coffin. Liam, her ex-husband, wasted absolutely no time. By Monday morning, his legal team officially filed an emergency motion for full unshared custody of their older children. He cited the massive public scandal, her proven infidelity, and the undeniable fact that she was being actively evicted and thrust into an unstable, volatile environment. The family court judge granted the motion swiftly. Jasmine was permanently stripped of her children, her housing, and her financial lifeline. She was left entirely alone, pregnant with twins, for a personal trainer who had already blocked her phone number. In the ensuing weeks, the brutal reality of their situation finally crashed down on Vivica and Terrence. The supplementary credit cards I had deactivated remained dead plastic in their wallets. The automated payments for their luxury vehicles bounced. The comfortable, wealthy retirement they had taken for granted vanished overnight. They suddenly realized that their precious golden child was a bankrupt liability, and the daughter they had spent 35 years discarding was the only financially solvent lifeline they had left. They desperately tried to crawl back. My voicemail began filling up with frantic, breathless messages from Vivica. The woman who had just threatened to have me dragged out of a country club by security was suddenly weeping into the phone, claiming that family needed to stick together through hard times. She begged me to find it in my heart to forgive them, insisting that grace and reconciliation were paramount. Terrence left messages telling me that I had made my point, and it was time to come back to the table and fix this mess like adults. I did not call them back. I drove to my cellular provider, canceled my old plan, and changed my phone number completely. But blocking their access to my peace was only the first step. I picked up my new phone and dialed my commercial real estate broker. I instructed him to immediately list the sprawling suburban property where Vivica and Terrence lived. The house where they had hosted countless Sunday dinners, the home I had purchased under my corporate holding company to ensure they had a comfortable retirement, was officially going on the market. My legal team served them with a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. They had spent my entire life worshiping Jasmine and treating me like an ungrateful burden. Now they were free to go live with the daughter they favored so deeply. I completely washed my hands of their survival. As for Julian, his descent was swift and pathetic. His commercial real estate firm formally dissolved under the weight of his insurmountable debt. The luxury leased cars were repossessed, and the custom suits were replaced by cheap wrinkled button-downs. He was forced to take a miserable mid-level desk job at a generic property management company, taking orders from men he used to mock. Every 2 weeks, a thick envelope would arrive at my corporate headquarters. The envelopes were filled with long, frantic, handwritten letters from Julian. He begged for a second chance. He wrote pages about how much he missed my quiet strength, how he was blinded by his own toxic ego, and how we had built a life together that was worth saving. I never read a single word of his apologies. I took a thick, bold red marker, wrote "Return to sender" across the front of every single envelope, and dropped them back into the outgoing mail bin. I did not owe him my anger, and I certainly did not owe him my grace. Absolute suffocating silence is the most lethal response you can give to a narcissist. A full year passed. The air in Atlanta turned crisp and cool, signaling the arrival of a new autumn. I stood on the wraparound balcony of my new ultra-modern estate in Buckhead. The property was a masterpiece of glass and steel, a tangible reflection of the empire I had built entirely on my own terms. My culinary business had officially expanded nationally. I had successfully launched 3 new high-end restaurant concepts across the coast, and my wealth had multiplied exponentially. I was no longer the quiet, reliable workhorse hiding in the shadows. I was the absolute, undisputed king of my own domain. The soft chime of the front gate intercom interrupted the quiet evening. I smiled and pressed the button to grant access. A few minutes later, the front door opened, and Loretta walked into the grand living area. Julian's mother carried a bottle of premium-aged Cabernet Sauvignon, her sharp eyes taking in the sleek, modern architecture with quiet approval. Our relationship had evolved beautifully over the past year. We did not talk about Julian. We did not discuss the wreckage he left behind. We had maintained a strong, unshakable bond, rooted in mutual respect, quiet dignity, and an unwavering commitment to the absolute truth. She respected me for refusing to be a victim, and I respected her for possessing the courage to tear down her own son's delusions when it mattered most. I walked into the kitchen, retrieved 2 crystal wine glasses, and pulled the cork from the bottle. I poured the rich, dark wine and handed a glass to Loretta. We clinked our glasses together in a silent, powerful toast to surviving the fire and emerging stronger on the other side. Loretta stepped back inside to admire a new piece of artwork hanging in the hallway. I turned and walked back out onto the balcony, the cool evening breeze catching the edge of my silk robe. I leaned against the glass railing and looked out over the glittering, sprawling expanse of the city skyline. The glowing lights of Atlanta stretched out for miles, a vast landscape of opportunity and endless potential. I brought the crystal glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine. The taste was rich, complex, and deeply satisfying. I thought about the heavy, suffocating cloak of shame I had worn for nearly a decade, the desperate need for validation from people who were entirely incapable of loving me, and the toxic, fragile men who tried to drain my resources to prop up their own egos. I had cut every single string that tied me to their dysfunction. I had orchestrated my own absolute liberation with ruthless, unapologetic precision. I looked out at the city, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of my own heart. I did not just survive their betrayal. I used it as the fuel to build an impenetrable fortress of success. A slow, confident, completely unbothered smile spread across my face. I was wealthy, I was at peace, and I was finally absolutely free. The greatest lesson to take away from this journey is that profound loyalty should never come at the expense of your own dignity. For years, protecting someone else's fragile ego might feel like an act of unconditional love, but true partnership does not require you to absorb the heavy burden of someone else's shame. When you continuously shrink yourself to fit into a narrative constructed by manipulative family members or an ungrateful partner, you only enable their profound disrespect. The moment you stop accepting less than you deserve, the entire power dynamic permanently shifts. Reclaiming your control often means walking away from the very people who are supposed to protect and cherish you. It requires the raw courage to let the harsh truth be exposed, allowing natural consequences to completely dismantle the arrogant illusions they built. You do not have to play the silent martyr in your own life. Your peace, your financial independence, and your mental well-being are infinitely more valuable than maintaining a deeply flawed family image. True liberation begins the exact second you realize your worth is not defined by those who are entirely incapable of appreciating it. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic family members to protect your own peace? Share your experiences in the comments below, and do not forget to hit like and subscribe for more stories of reclaiming your independence.